don't leave your home. Because you know what? When those companies say they have your mortgage, unless you have a lawyer that can put his finger or her finger on that mortgage, you don't have that mortgage. And you're going to find they can't find the paper up there on Wall Street. So I say to the American people, you be squatters in your own homes. Don't you leave.
Existential point. You live somewhere. Maybe you live in a city or a town or in an unincorporated area like I grew up in, but you live somewhere. And wherever you live, the land you live on, literally the ground under your feet, is owned by someone or some corporation or maybe a government. One of the first things Americans did as citizens was set up public registries to keep track of who owns which land. If you and your neighbor disagree about a fence one of you wants to build, there should be an empirical answer as to which of you is right and where that fence can go. And the answer to where that fence can go is in books like these. They tell us who owns what and how the land in our towns is bought and sold, how it is mortgaged and paid for or not. This is important stuff. And the public record is a clear thing. Or it should be when the system works right. I want you to meet Lori Lanier. Lori Lanier lives in Greensboro, North Carolina. This is her here driving. Lori showed our producer Laura Conaway around Greensboro, North Carolina this week. Greensboro is a town of not quite 300,000 people. It's in central North Carolina, sort of between Raleigh and Winston-Salem. She drove us through her neighborhood to one particular house where she was friendly with the owner. You can see that it's a normal house in a normal neighborhood. It's not far from the big university in town. Lori Lanier works in real estate in this neighborhood, and she says they are going through a new round of foreclosures there now. She says there's been actually a couple of suicides in families that have lost their homes. The house that Lori wants to show us, as you can see, is boarded up. Being abandoned takes a toll on a house. On the door, there's a new sign that tells you to call the bank if you have any questions.
If this property is not vacant, please call your mortgage servicer immediately. Wow. Doesn't have a... Okay, we got a date, 3/19.
So they were just here. Just
yeah,
3
this
days
is new
ago.
to me. I mean, this is new to me. Please call Wells Fargo.
The owner of that particular house ended up in the newspapers last month after he got into a 15-hour standoff with police. He was a chiropractor, by all accounts a regular guy, and now you can direct inquiries about his house to Wells Fargo. They've got his house now. Stories like that drew Lori Lanier to go to Occupy Greensboro last week. The group held a big event in the old movie theater downtown, a big event about foreclosures, and 400 people showed up, a few of them telling their stories about losing homes. That's happening all over the country, but there's not that many places where you can talk personally about the fact that it's happening. It can be not just upsetting, but embarrassing. You can feel like you're the only one. That night last week, a couple of occupiers screened a movie that they made to try to explain all the foreclosures and why this is a crisis. They're trying out new ways of explaining, new ways of acting out how the banks wrecked the economy and document mills and forged signatures, how the banks lured people into loans they couldn't afford and loans that didn't make sense, how they traded those loans, those everyday houses, like they were casino chips. They're looking for new ways to help the public understand what happened when all this happened. They're also looking for new things to do about it. Here and across the country. In Greensboro, the occupiers have started formal training for volunteers, like Lori Lanier, to examine the documents in new foreclosures, to look for signs that the bank has not got the right to kick that particular family out onto the street.
You'll be trained to seek out evidence of fraud, including robo-signing.
If the documents don't hold up to scrutiny, then the bank might not be able to foreclose, or the family might at least be able to get into a better position to negotiate an extension or a new payment plan or something. Already, Occupy Greensboro filled up its first fraud detection training. 35 regular Americans, just citizens, saying they are ready to dive into records at the county clerk's office to help some homeowner they maybe don't even know. And more North Carolina counties are asking for classes like this, too. Going after the banks by going through their paperwork turns out to be not that hard to do. Regular people can do it with a little training. And people want to do it. It's popular. People want to take these trainings and learn how to do this thing. It kind of makes you a mix between a geek and a save-your-house superhero. And the popularity of doing this, though, is in part because it works. These folks diving into bank records for signs of mortgage fraud, it is looking more and more like they may really be onto something. This is Jeff Thigpen in his office in Greensboro, North Carolina. He's the elected county register of deeds, which under normal circumstances is one of the most humble, little-noticed jobs in government, right? Jeff Thigpen's got Greensboro records going back to 1771. If you ask him, he will pull down the old books and show them to you. All this documentation of who owns what, signed by actual humans using their real names and old-fashioned ink in the 1700s. The records showing who owns what, going back as long as the government exists, basically. It's who owns what land and who owes who money for it. But Jeff, this county register, says he cannot be sure anymore who owns what in Greensboro, or who owes whom, or who has the right to kick anybody out of their house and into the street for not paying. Jeff Thigpen's little county register office in North Carolina went back through a few years of records, and they found, just for a few years, thousands of documents filed by big banks and mortgage companies in these document mills. Thousands of documents that Jeff Thigpen says look to him like forgeries. Like the companies that filed them just did not care.
I can't make up my mind as to whether or not they're walking over me or they're just completely ignoring me, and both are pretty humiliating, It's just kind of take your pick. Which one is it? And
except that now you can sue.
Yes, we can sue.
Last week, Jeff Thigpen's little county office took more than 24 big banks and mortgage companies to court. It's Jeff versus Bank of America, Jeff versus Wells Fargo. He says they wrecked 250 years of fair dealing in his county, and it's his job to fix it. Quote, this lawsuit seeks to have defendants clean up the mess they created. That's from paragraph 1. It is hard to put a legal case more plainly than that. Jeff Thigpen wants the court to appoint an investigator to go through the documents on people's houses, to find the mistakes and to set things right. He wants the banks to clean up the mess he says they have made for his office, the mess they have made in his county by making a mockery of the legal paperwork that you need to prove you own something in America. He says until the banks do that, the people of his county cannot buy and sell property with any real confidence about who owns it. The records, he said, have been that corrupted by the banks. And, he says, the families kicked out of their homes, the bank documents that justified that, some of those documents, he says, may have been fraud.
Public recording offices are part of our democracy and the rule of law, and the laws that govern them need to be respected. And if you don't respect that, then why am I any better than Wikipedia? I mean, and if that's the case, Wikipedia would be better than me.
Explain that.
Well, I mean, at least on Wikipedia, you'll have multiple people trying to correct what's going on and get the story right. All we would be doing would be logging in information signed by people 4 to 15 different times with no verification, and then people could go out and use it for what they'd have the legal force of Wikipedia through my office. I mean, it's basically, if you don't get public recording offices right, you don't get the judicial system right. I mean, if these documents are certified for my office and used in court proceedings, if they are not right, it is a fraud on the court system, baby.
Jeff Thigpen says he has already found about 36 foreclosures in Greensboro, 36, where he now considers the documents that justified those foreclosures to be seriously in question. 36 Greensboro families put out on the street who maybe should not have been. What has happened in Jeff's office, this situation with thousands of documents that he says appear to have stuff missing or forged signatures, this same situation quite likely exists in every county in the United States. And if you look around, you will now see that lawsuits like this Greensboro one are popping up in Ohio and in Kentucky and in Oklahoma and in Massachusetts with the promises of more to come. So far, these clerks who are suing have been losing these cases. But if these lowly clerks start winning, and it looks like they might, then this becomes a very big deal because there are thousands of these clerks. There are thousands of counties. There are thousands of people like Jeff Thigpen out there who have these responsibilities and take them seriously. And with the occupiers and the volunteers and the families being foreclosed on and the county clerks and the courts all going through the records, the banks may start losing for what they did to those records on the way to doing what they did to what used to be our economy. If the clerks start winning, we might start proving that the early warnings were right, like Marcy Kaptur back in the dark winter of 2009 when she told Americans to be squatters in their own homes. Because while the banks were getting rich trading and gambling on your houses, they did not bother doing the work to prove who owned anything or who owed anything, for that matter. At the time she made it, that argument from Marcy Kaptur sounded revolutionary and impassioned. It was a manifesto from the populist fringe. That argument is no longer fringy. Now it is a day's work in the Greensboro County Registrar's office, getting the basic paperwork of who owns what in this country back in good order again, like we have prioritized since the 1700s. The banks are scared of this, and they ought to be. They have been trying to work out deals to avoid responsibility for what they did at the federal level and at the state level. They are trying to get themselves off this hook. I would, too, if I were them. But the Jeff Thigpens of the world and the Occupy Greensboros of the world and the Lori Laniers of the world are trying to get American families off of that hook first. And they might win on this, and it's a big deal.